World Series of Fighting 33 and UFC 204 was this past weekend. Starting first with World Series of Fighting 33 from Kansas City, shown live on NBC Sports Network. Originally, Justin Gaethje was supposed to take on Ozzy Dubligov. That bout was scrapped after Dubligov fell ill on Friday afternoon, I believe just before the weigh-ins. So that doesn't look like that will happen. However, Justin Gaethje, who has already stated that he would like to fight on their New Year's Eve card set for the Madison Square Garden Arena Theater, looks as though most likely Justin Gaethje will probably be the main event for that card coming up in December. The new main event ended up being David Branch against Vinny Magalhaes for David Branch's light heavyweight championship. Ended up being a 6-fight main card. Started with Timur Valiev against Chris Gutierrez. Very dominant performance by Timur, scoring 30-27 on two cards and 29-28 on the other. Did really good job with his wrestling, took Gutierrez down, who really didn't have much of an answer off his back against Timur, and no surprise that Valiev was able to come through with the victory. In the heavyweight division, Sean Jordan against Ashley Gooch. Sean Jordan, of course, many fans may remember that name. He fought in the UFC for the last few years, making his debut in the World Series of Fighting. Did so pretty dominantly over Ashley, first-round knockout, 440. Jordan probably will fight for the title next, most likely. Maybe Shamil Rama will factor in as well. I believe he's fighting next month for World Series of Fighting as the co-main event. So Sean Jordan's a guy that I always thought was a pretty talented individual. Had some pretty good wins in the UFC, but kind of surprised to hear he was cut. But World Series of Fighting gets maybe one of the best heavyweights that's not in the UFC in their organization now. Abu Akbar Nurmagomedov took on John Howard, and John Howard, to me, just didn't really have too much of a sense of urgency. It really seemed like the speed of Nurmagomedov was the difference in this fight, and John Howard didn't really counter it and didn't really try to up the output, in my opinion. Also, Nurmagomedov was able to mix some takedowns as well, so no surprise to me he won this fight 29-28 on two cards, 30-27 on the other. And for Howard, again, he is a solid fighter, but you got to pick up the pace. It's just like he never had a sense of urgency in this fight, and it really to me seemed like Nurmagomedov was winning since the first round, and John Howard needed to do something, and he never really made any mid-fight adjustments to me, and no surprise that Nurmagomedov was able to get the victory there. Brian Foster against Luis Firmino. Impressive performance there by Brian Foster, again, against a great Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy. Firmino definitely had some chances there. He got on top, he got a takedown, was landing damage, but Brian Foster in a transition was able to throw up the legs and get the triangle choke and get the tap there at 3:14, and awfully impressive performance. Obviously, he would like a rematch against Justin Gaethje, and while Gaethje could possibly try to take on Dubligov again, if Dubligov is not ready to go for New Year's, maybe Brian Foster ends up who being. So World Series of Fighting definitely has a few options here for Justin Gaethje. The main event of the evening, David Branch against Vinny Magalhaes. If it didn't turn into a grappling battle, which I still think would have been pretty entertaining considering Branch is a pretty high-level black belt as well, standing on the feet, Vinny's never been that great of an individual and has never really developed that part of his game, even going back to his time many, many years ago on The Ultimate Fighter. And that was kind of the case here. Branch was able to, really in that second round, is to me kind of what changed the point. I mean, his hand speed, obviously being a more natural middleweight, a big difference. Vinny had a lot of trouble dealing with the striking combinations of David Branch and the overall hand speed that Branch brought to the table. But after that second round where Branch was very close to putting this fight away from a knockout, to me, Vinny just kind of survived those last 3 rounds. And I think because he's a bigger guy, he was able to take a lot of the shots from Branch, again, not being an overly big light heavyweight, a guy, again, who was also the World Series of Fighting middleweight champion as well. So, dominant performance for David Branch. I believe Magalhaes ended up retiring after the fight. But I think kind of expected. I think really if Vinny didn't get him in those first couple rounds, Branch, again, being kind of a smaller guy, didn't really have to cut hardly any weight for this fight. you probably would give him the edge there in conditioning if this thing went into the championship rounds like it did. So David Branch defends the light heavyweight title successfully. It'll be interesting to see if he'll defend his middleweight title next, coming up here on New Year's Eve, if they're going to want to have him there, if he'll be ready to go. Obviously, I believe he is from the New York area and still lives and trains there, so obviously I'm sure it'd be kind of a hometown fight of sorts for him. So I'm assuming if he can get cleared in time, which he should. I mean, really, other than fighting the 5 rounds, he really didn't take too much damage from Vinny, so I'm sure that'll be something to look forward to having him do, is defend his middleweight title there, and of course probably Justin Gaethje as well. Maybe even a third fight, maybe even Lance Palmer factors in as well, as he actually joined the commentary there a little bit with Renzo Gracie and Todd Harris. So actually pretty solid World Series of Fighting event. Now, actually, the 6-fight main card moved pretty well. A couple of good finishes, especially the Foster. So solid card there on Friday night. Moving to a couple of news and note items before I get to my recap of the UFC 204 main card. There has been rumors coming out that Conor McGregor was knocked out during a training session this past week in preparation for his title fight against Eddie Alvarez at UFC 205. I don't know what's the big deal. I mean, as long as he's still cleared to fight, which as of right now he is, the fight's not off or anything. This is probably not the first time this has happened, probably not the last time. I don't know how these rumors got started. There was also a rumor that may have broken his nose. He posted a photo on Instagram not too many days later after all these rumors came out. His face looked fine, so I'm not really sure where these rumors were coming from, but unless Conor actually came out and said the fight's off, then I don't really hold a lot of stock into that. I didn't even see in a statement from the UFC, so I don't know. If you're looking out there think the fight's in jeopardy, I don't think so. I don't think anything's happening with that front as of right now. Also, I believe later this afternoon, Dana White will be on the Callan Cowherd program, better known as The Herd. It looks like he will be discussing some things. Chief among them may be perhaps a new broadcast deal, either with Fox Sports or other media outlets. Also, rumors are swirling that the main event for the New Year's Eve card for the UFC would be Ronda Rousey against Amanda Nunes, and then most likely the co-main event of Dominic Cruz and Cody Garbrandt. Again, nothing is official, but it looks as though Ronda Rousey may return against Amanda Nunes to try to get her title back there on New Year's Eve. And of course, also rumor has it that GSP against Anderson Silva may serve as the main event for UFC 206, already slated as the co-main event, and I guess could be the main event if they're not able to book a match of that magnitude. Daniel Cormier against Rumble Johnson for the second time will happen for the light heavyweight championship on 206, regardless of what could be a main event or co-main event, depending on what all goes down. And I'm really glad that Rumble Johnson is getting the shot. The John Jones situation, he doesn't really deserve to be input back in. You could even make a case that he should have to fight another one as an extra punishment. But to have Rumble Johnson fight John Jones, again, a fight people want to see, but just in terms of rankings, it doesn't make any sense because Daniel Cormier also lost a pretty good chunk of change not being in the main event of UFC 200. And even with Brock Lesnar, that card definitely lost some pay-per-view buys because of John Jones. And if Daniel Cormier didn't fight Rumble Johnson here in December, he would have had to wait then. If John Jones could have even went in December, which it doesn't look like he could have went anyway, but even if he could, then Daniel Cormier would have to wait a few more months. We're looking at maybe April, potentially, before Daniel Cormier fights again. That's nearly 8 months off, and he only fought once. And if this fight wasn't scheduled, he would have only fought once in 2015, and would have only fought twice in roughly 18 months. And this is a guy that, is definitely towards the end of his career. He wants to try to fight as many times as possible. And like I said, especially when he missed out on a pretty big payday there. I mean, he still got paid well, but not as well as he could have had he still been the main event against John Jones. So for Daniel Cormier, you're not doing him a disservice. And after him, after this whole thing falling through twice now, once because of injury and the second time, obviously, Well, actually 3 times, really, because he obviously was supposed to rematch John, I believe, back in May. Or no, John pulled out of his fight against Rumble, and then, of course, Cormier killed him. But either way, a lot of things have been messed up because of John Jones. So there really should be no concessions made to him whatsoever, especially regarding the championship. So let's see. I think that's about it for news and notes items. There's no fights coming up this week, so no major organizations are having any sort of event. It won't be, at least for the UFC, they won't be returning to action until November 5th down in Mexico City with Tony Ferguson against Rafael Dos Anjos. Bellator will have a card next week. That's Shlemenko against Kendall Grove, and also Glory will hold a event over in Denver, Glory 34, now featuring Nikki Holtzkin against Myrtle Gronhart. That welterweight title fight will be on the card, as well as the already named main event of Gabriel Vara against Robin van Roosmalen for their featherweight championship. There also will be a middleweight tournament. Dustin Jacoby will be featured, former guest of the show. Also 2 other former Glory guests, Richard Abraham and Casey Green, will also be featured on the card as well. And also, Glory has announced their next event, 35, in Nice, France, or Nice, I think. And that will serve with a heavyweight tournament, Zach Muikasa against Vahitov for the unification of the light heavyweight championship. And then the main event will be the lightweight title, as Petrosian will take on Sitchai. So that's what's coming up there. And, of course, in December, the Rico Bato card, and we'll see what else happens to be on that card as well. But with that said, let's get to UFC 204 this past weekend in Manchester, England. Looking real quickly at the undercard, a big win there by Mike Perry, his second consecutive victory in his second straight UFC fight, knocking out Danny Roberts in the 3rd round. Very excellent performance for him. Also a big win for Leon Edwards, as he was able to submit Albert Tumanov in the 3rd round via rear naked choke. Davy Grant against Damian Stasiak, if I said that correctly. He got kind of upsets of sorts, getting armbarred in the 3rd round. So big win there for Damian. Also, early Alcantara had a very dominant and quick finish victory, netting him one of the Performance of the Night bonuses, submitting Brad Pickett in the 1st round via triangle choke, where Pickett tried his best after that spinning back fist to get out of a submission by Alcantara, but like 3 or 4 transitions between armbar, choke, and eventually finally back into a triangle choke, getting the tap there at 159. Nice victory there for Alcantara against a very tough guy in Brad Pickett. Looking at the main card, started first off in the featherweight division, where I did go 4-1 in my picks, as I got this one right, as Mirsad Betik took on injury replacement Russell Doan, who took this fight on short notice. And Doan, he gave it a valiant effort. I mean, he took this fight on short notice, up a weight class against a very big and strong guy like Betik. And after kind of an initial feeling out process with some striking, Betik went right to the grappling, as I thought he would. Was able to take this fight to the ground, eventually get the back of Doan and get the tap in. And obviously, Doan is a natural bantamweight, and I give him credit, but Betik's just the bigger and stronger guy, and it was going to be really hard for Doan to combat that if he wasn't able to get in a sort of rhythm with the striking early, using his what should have been a perceived speed advantage with the hands. And if he wasn't able to do that, Betik was probably going to do what he did. And good on Betik for, Russell Doan's no slouch even in the bantamweight division, so this is a solid victory for him, but obviously a real test for him will be taking on some close to or actually top 15 talent to see if this guy is for real, but definitely a bright prospect in what is really the last year or two become a very deep featherweight division. Heavyweight for the next fight, Stefan Struve against Daniel Olmanchuk, and not a great performance by Daniel, but I'm not really sure what his game plan is, but he didn't really seem to have much of a game plan. On the feet, he was actually doing pretty well. He did a good job moving forward. He didn't allow Struve to set up his jab or kicks to really establish his reign. I thought he was doing a good job of bringing the fight to Struve. Struve was kind of able to adjust a little bit and started kind of going into grappling mode, an area where I thought Struve could take advantage of because I didn't like Daniel in his last fight against Olenek. So I thought Struve, with pretty good submission skills, could take advantage, especially if he got on top or the bottom. I thought he could potentially win the fight that way if the striking wasn't going his way, which it wasn't. And 2 takedowns for Struve, one in the first, one in the second. I think the first takedown probably would have gave him the first round. It was close because Daniel was winning on the feet, as I was saying. In the second round, Struve was able to get the fight back to the ground. There was an initial choke attempt there with the Dars, but then Ullman kind of actually helped Struve get the choke. He kind of turned back around and actually more into the choke. That really helped Struve cinch that up and able to get the tap there at 141. And it just didn't seem like Daniel, I don't know if because of the choke was cutting off oxygen to his head, which that's what it's designed to do, but it just didn't seem like he really knew how to get out of that position, because tactically he moved completely the opposite way that you should when you're in that position to try to get out of a choke. And I'm not sure what that was, but obviously Struve might have got the finish regardless, but Daniel didn't really help his cause in there and kind of moved right back into it and even helped Struve sync it up better. And this is a nice win for Struve, his second win in a row, I believe, after losing to Jared Rochel back in November of last year. So nice win for him, and also his second consecutive finish bonus. So this is nice for Struve. Obviously, he's one of the few young guys, the few guys under 30 years old in the heavyweight division, and obviously he does have a victory over the current heavyweight champion, Stipe Miocic. So if he can get a couple more wins together, he obviously is a factor, especially if Stipe remains the champion. So this is good for Struve. He's always I think it's really hard to hate a guy like Stefan Struve. I mean, he's just so big, and he's just such a interesting guy to see in the cage. I think a lot of people like seeing him compete, so it's nice to see him get on a roll and get a victory over who I believe was ranked number 15 there in Daniel Olmachuk. Next fight of the evening in the light heavyweight division, Jimi Manuwa. I'm not sure what OSP this was, but this is not the OSP, even short notice against John Jones, or even the guy we saw against Ryan Bader, or Shogun Hua, or Cavalcante, or Cummings, or Glover Teixeira. I don't know what Ovince SaintPreux was. I don't know if he had a bad weight cut, if he was kind of hurt coming into this fight, or if the time zone, because again, they were fighting at like 3 or 4 in the morning. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, or what, but it just didn't seem like Ovince had that same fire, that same intensity and unbridled power that he usually brings to the table. And Manuwa kind of just took what was given him. I mean, a couple of takedowns by Ovince probably would have gave Ovince the first round. He landed 2 takedowns. It looked like if he could continue to do that, Manuwa would have a tough time. But in the second round, it seemed like all energy was just sapped from Ovince. I don't know if that was from a couple of the kicks that landed, especially that one really good inside lane kick that Manuwa landed, or the few. There were a couple of power punches that kind of stagger him, but I still probably would have gave Ovince the first round. But it just didn't seem like he had anything left, and Manuwa kind of sensed that, started throwing a lot of powerful shots, and just got on him in a hurry there in the second round after landing a very nice right hand, and was all over Ovince. And Leon Roberts, that is, had to step in and stop this one at 2:38 in the second round for a huge win by Jimi Manuwa, definitely the biggest of his career. Ovince was ranked number 5 coming into this fight. Manuwa was ranked number 8, and really, I guess his best victory to date probably was over Ryan Jimmo, but I don't know what Ovince that was. I'm not taking anything away from Jimi Manuwa because he got the job done, but that's not the Ovince SaintPreux I expected in this fight. And I wouldn't be surprised if something comes out that maybe he was hurt or he had a bad weight cut or what, but he just did not perform there, and Jimi Manuwa took a full advantage of it and got the second round knockout. The next fight of the evening, the co-main event in the middleweight division, Gegard Mousasi against Vitor Belfort. Again, as I said, I think if Vitor didn't finish this thing in the first 2.5 minutes, he was going to have problems, and that's kind of what happened. I mean, he had a few moments. He definitely landed a couple of nice combinations, but the output of Gegard Mousasi and the stalking of Vitor Belfort, getting his back up against the cage, not really allowing Vitor to set up a lot of big punches and kicks at range, did a good job of kind of trapping him up against the cage where he really wasn't able to extend the full force of his power into those combinations. And really, other than that little flurry there at the beginning of the first round, which Vitor smartly didn't overdo himself, because that he's done that at times in his career, and then he's had nothing left. He didn't do that, but it just seemed like after that, Mousasi kind of saw what he was featuring, felt what he was featuring, and adjusted his strategy, mixed in some nice kicks, and just overall his hand speed is at a level that Vitor is not at right now. Years ago he was, but right now he is not. And eventually those combinations started to land up, coupled in with a takedown there in the second round, and eventually he got mount, finished this thing off, and very impressive victory for Gegard Mousasi, who I think now puts himself one away from a title shot. Most likely, he faces whoever doesn't get the title shot of this little mini four-way kind of middleweight fights we got coming up between Romero and Weidman, and obviously Jacare and Rockhold. My money has the winner of Jacare Rockhold getting the title shot no matter what, unless the performance is bad or there's an injury. So in that case, the winner of Weidman and Romero would probably take on Gegard Mousasi for a number one contender sometime early 2017. That's my initial thoughts. Obviously, again, anything could happen. Maybe Romero backs out, or Weidman gets hurt, or Rockhold gets hurt, or Jacare and Mousasi can fill in, which could speed up a possible title shot. But right now, he's on a 3-fight winning streak, and if you need to extend that, further, he's won 5 out of his last 6. He's beaten the likes of Dan Henderson, Costa Falopu, Talas Leites, Thiago Santos, and now Vitor Belfort. And his only losses since coming to the UFC are to Jacare, Machida, and Uriah Hall. Now, the Hall one, that definitely, stopped some momentum for him, but, that's not a horrible loss, in my opinion. So, he's done very well since coming into the organization. He'd now record his 40th professional victory. I really think that's what's next for him. He's probably one fight away from a title shot, and of course injuries are always a factor in this game, so he's the guy that possibly even on injury thing could be called up, because he took relatively little damage, so anything could happen here coming up in the middleweight division. But I think with that victory, and obviously Vitor probably announced his retirement along with the guy in the main event that I'll get to in just a second, but great victory for Vitor Belfort, a guy I have enjoyed watching over these past 15 years, and definitely is one of the legends of the sport, one of the pioneers of the sport as well, going back to his early days in the UFC, one of the first big young stars that the UFC had. Obviously also fought in Pride as well, did capture the UFC light heavyweight championship, has beaten some of the best in the game, including Dan Henderson and Wanderlei Silva and Michael Bisping and Luke Rockhold, just to name a few. So this is a guy who definitely, I think, will get into the UFC Hall of Fame and had a very storied career. And if he would want, probably would be a pretty good coach either in Brazil or with the Black Zillions in South Florida. So whatever he wants to do, I'm sure he can be successful at it. But it was a great run, and it's probably going to be a while before we've seen another guy quite like Vitor Belfort. Main event of the evening for the UFC Middleweight Championship, Michael Bisping against Dan Henderson for the second time. Watching this fight live, excellent fight. Scoring it live, I would have gave it for Michael Bisping, which is not the popular opinion. I would have scored rounds 2, 3, and 4 for Michael Bisping and rounds 1 and 5 for Dan Henderson. Now that I've had a few days to kind of digest, and again, I know the judges don't have the courtesy of doing that, but rethinking it over my head and really thinking at it logically and looking at the fight metric stats, did Michael Bisping outstrike Dan Henderson in that second round, which to me was the key round in this fight? Yes, 36-13, outthrew him 82-39. However, in that last minute to 45 seconds, Dan Henderson was able to land another H-bomb and was once again close to putting this fight away. So does that outdo the 23-strike discrepancy? I think it does. Thinking back on it, looking it over, thinking how that second round went, I think Dan Henderson ended up taking that second round, which, if that is then is the case, and I score everything else with Bisping taking rounds 3 and 4, then, of course, Dan Henderson wins, becomes the UFC middleweight champion. However, scoring it live, the judges ended up seeing it 49-46, and then 48-47 for a unanimous decision. I was a little surprised it wasn't split. I thought one judge would score it 48-47 Henderson. The judge there, Andy Roberts, everybody's maligning him for scoring this 49-46. I don't think you can make a case for either gentleman 4-1. I just don't see it. I really don't. I think the clearest rounds to score are round 1 for Dan Henderson and rounds 3 and 4 for Michael Bisping. I feel like those ones are definite cases, and you can't really argue too much against it. You can make a case for either gentleman in round 2 and 5. However, I would have gave round 5. A lot of people are saying that was a key round, and it was, but I would have gave round 5 to Dan Henderson. He did get outstruck 22-16. However, he did land a takedown in that round. So that to me, and also I thought Henderson was being more aggressive, and it seemed like Bisping was slowing down slightly in that round. Obviously, he came super close to finishing this fight in the first round and the second round, very reminiscent of their first matchup 7 years ago at UFC 100. And while, again, I was saying it was nothing against Dan, everybody loves Dan, he had a great career regardless whether he won this fight or even if he ever got another chance at a UFC championship after fighting for back-to-back championships back at UFC 82 and I think UFC, I want to say 87? No, UFC 86, somewhere around there. When he, of course, he fought Anderson Silva and then... Oh, no, he actually fought Rampage Jackson. I think that was UFC 75, yeah. Then Anderson Silva at UFC 82. He obviously hadn't had a title shot in the UFC after that point. And would have went down as a legend regardless. This just cements his GOAT status, if you will. And some people are saying, oh, it's because it was in England. Yeah, that may have had something to do with it. Oh, they should judge fights based on damage. You can't really do that because every guy wears differently, or, you know, one little... It could end up being a cut from an illegal thing that makes it look really bad. So you can't really judge a fight by how their face looks or how their body looks. You can't start getting into stuff like that. That really paints a gray area. And, you know, looking at the striking numbers, it is surprising, you know, that Henderson did whiff a lot. I mean, 87 to 227 is not exactly a great clip. Bisping missed a lot too. Henderson, for the most part, avoided a lot of it. I mean, 130 of 348. 348 is usually on par with a guy of Bisping's output, but 130, you would expect Bisping to be somewhere closer to 200. And I think if he would have been in that 200 range, he probably would have won this fight hands down. I mean, at that point, he would have got really blitzed. But I think after those first 2 rounds, Bisping was a lot more cautious and was really, really afraid of getting caught again. And I think while he had the output, they were tentative. There were a lot of shots coming at range. There weren't as much conviction had he not been afraid of the right hand. And with good reason. He should be afraid of the right hand, obviously. He already got knocked out by it once and nearly got knocked out a few more times. So with good reason, it was not. It was an okay performance by Bisping. I think it's a performance you could say he won, but looking back at it, you know, who was the closer to winning the fight, who did the most damage, it definitely was Dan Henderson. So while I initially had it scored for Bisping and I could see how Bisping won, I can't really argue with Bisping winning. The 4-1, everyone would agree, but Dan Henderson probably should have won that fight. He gets the fight of the night. I mean, he goes out great. I mean, really, he put a heck of a performance, so he can't, you know, he has to be proud with that. You know, at 46 years old, keeping up with the guy, I would say probably a little bit past his prime, but still, you know, closer to his prime than Dan is, obviously. And he did it in enemy territory, and he gave it his best shot. He really did, and he should be proud of that, proud of his career, proud of how he carried himself, not only as a person, but as a professional athlete. And he's the guy that should be in the Hall of Fame right now. They should just book it. There should be no debate about that. He's going in, and definitely a true pioneer of this sport, and definitely not only just for who he's beat, for just his longevity. I mean, no one has been able to compete at this level that long. I mean, into their 40s. You don't see that in any sport. The only guy I could think of is Julio Franco in Major League Baseball. That's it. Maybe Jamie Moyer too, but that's about it. That's baseball. This is a full contact where you're getting hit in the head and beat up. So, all the credit in the world to Dan Henderson for the effort, and could end up winning Fight of the Year too, and just an excellent career. And for Michael Bisping, he's got a lot of challengers. Obviously, he barely gets by, 46-year-old Dan Henderson. How's he going to fare against a rejuvenated Luke Rockhold, or a hungry grappling master in Jacare, or a tricky wrestler like Chris Weidman, or just a freak powerhouse like Yoel Romero? So a lot of interesting challenges, and obviously you got the cerebral striker there in Gegard Mousasi to add in the picture too, and obviously Derek Brunson's a guy that's on the roll too. So a lot of guys right now. Middleweight's probably as strong as it has been in quite a long time. So no shortage of challengers for Michael Bisping, who I'm sure early to mid 2017 will he defend his title against somebody. Before I go, once again, I am your host, Jim Graham. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim Graham, and follow Beyond the Cage on Facebook, facebook.com/Beyond the Cage Podcast, and subscribe to the channel right here on YouTube, youtube.com/Beyond the Cage Podcast. I'd like to thank my new partners at Sports Talk 313. Of course, this is a Michigan and Detroit-based podcast, despite covering the national scene there of mixed martial arts. I'm very much proud of my state and city, and so I'm honored to be part with my friends there at Sports Talk 313, joining their lineup of talking about Michigan sports. So you can check out the show, as well as links to my SoundCloud there at Sports Talk 313. You can follow them on Twitter, Facebook, all that good stuff is the website, sportstalk313.com. Also, of course, as you know, MMA Fight Club, MMAFightClub.net, their brand new, sparkling new website. Check it out. Another way to listen to Beyond the Cage and check out new stories. And, of course, join the conversation, chatting with fellow mixed martial arts fans at facebook.com/MMA Fight Club, and join their page today and the discussion. Also like to thank Flying Brian J. for always retweeting the show, as well as Legend of the Cage, the King, Izzy Garcia. I also like to thank for supporting Beyond the Cage. Of course, my great friend AJ Hiller, running MMASignaturesUSA.com, the #1 site in the world for mixed martial arts memorabilia. So check out the website again, MMASignaturesUSA.com. Also like to thank the MMA community for always supporting Beyond the Cage, some of the best forums in the world to discuss mixed martial arts, and also doing live question and answer sessions with various professional MMA fighters. So again, sign up, it's free, have some fun, and talk with fans at MMAcommunity.com. Once again, I'm your host, Jim Graham. Until next week, thank you for listening to another edition of Beyond the Cage.